Hey everybody, and welcome to another installment of the Ember Sword podcast. I'm Svetlin, your humble host, and I'm here with Loren, our executive producer. Today, we're going to be talking about building an MMO one piece at a time. Loren, welcome.
Thank you, Svetlin.
So, massive games. We've all had some experiences with them, and building them is certainly no small chore. Hell, releasing them to a whole bunch of people can be a terrifying experience, especially for developers. I mean, there's been some disasters in recent years. Just to name a few, Diablo 3's whole fiasco about just flat out not working for a whole week. Both Destiny games, which are heralded as almost the pinnacle of live service games nowadays, those launched in an appalling state. Lacking content, eventually content being cut out. So releasing a massive game is no small feat, certainly. So Loren, my question to you is, how are we going to make sure that doesn't happen with us and it's actually, a great experience?
Oh, well, there's always praying and hoping for the best, but yeah,
I'm sure Bungie has a little rosary on every single one of their desks.
Absolutely. No, but all kidding aside, the reality is that when you're building something as massive as an MMO and you're then releasing that all pretty much in one go, despite having maybe had some kind of limited beta test, which is then, something that at least limits your exposure a little bit. It's typically never sufficient to get to a really good release. And there's been a lot of, I think, mistakes made in that arena in terms of pushing things out that just had not been broadly enough, let's say, subjected to the community and some level of broader scrutiny and heavier load testing.
Well, yeah, shit, more to the point, beta nowadays isn't even used correctly most of the time. I envision Fallout 76 when I say that. They had a beta, 2 weeks before the game launched? That's not a good outlook. That doesn't help anybody.
No, exactly, and that's kind of more to say. Oh yeah, we checked if our servers kind of survived with the amount of people joining, right? And then when 10 to 20 to 30 times more people join, obviously everything falls apart. But that is only the technical part of the spectrum, right? That's like the infamous Diablo era that lasted for about a week, that basically locked everyone out of the game.
God, that was nuts.
It's terrible, but on the other hand, that's easy to fix. I mean, comparatively to, let's say, launching a game which just has had insufficient iteration time on particular features, because indeed you went into beta 2 weeks before launch, 2 months before launch, heck, even half a year before launch can be way too little time for a game as massive as an MMO to, for example, tune how your PvE combat feels or how your PvP combat feels. All these kind of things. Even player-created content, etc., they just benefit so much from spending more time in the hands of the players, with the devs kind of mindfully watching, seeing what do people do with this, how are they experiencing it, is everything working the way we would like it to work, or are there things that we can change and that we can improve, right? So that is basically something that is really important to us when we're working on Ember Sword here. And the way we're actually trying to do that with Ember Sword is, rather than pushing out this enormous MMO all at once, we're actually breaking it up into little chunks, little experiences, and then sort of rolling these experiences out progressively, first to a rather intimate, smaller testing audience, and eventually all the way to the community, basically ensuring that actual slices of our game, you might even say full-on fun little game experiences, are playable already long before the game is done. Now, aside from the fact that it gets us lots of awesome data when it comes to testing and improving our gameplay, the additional bonus element to it, of course, is that as part of the community, you'll also slowly get to experience more and more elements of what Ember Sword is going to bring to the table, rather than, sort of just having to wait it out for years, only to then find out kind of what the game is going to be like. So we'd much rather, once a piece of the game is far enough along that we're ready to share it with you, share that with you, and grow based off that.
It's honestly reassuring to hear that at least somebody's taking this like iterative process of game development seriously. Because again, I'm very into live games, a lot of them. So and most of them, like I said, horrible launches. So to hear that this is how we're approaching Ember Sword is really good. On the topic, what are those experiences that we're working on?
Right. Well, obviously we have quite a lineup of them waiting, but there is like currently three core ones that I can tell you a little bit about that we are working on, and all of them center around our PVE experience. Um, those experiences are an arena, an outdoor adventure near a place called Tycho Village, and our very first raid-like experience in a place called the Ultra Deep.
Ooh.
So these are kind of experiences that allow us to play around with our PvE experience, with the way creatures react when they're fighting the players, with our AI game master that is dealing with with these cinematic moments that we're trying to create, which, by the way, I covered in another podcast with you, right?
Yeah.
We're doing so much interesting stuff there, actually, just on the sort of micro level of what's going on in your screen, that we want to be able to test that out early. We want to really see that, when people get out into the arena, for example, that they have an experience of PvE that yields some really epic experiences, footage, etc. That's something that you can do together in a really fun and interesting way. And that kind of then is expanded further because the arena, being a fairly closed environment, is actually a place where you'll fight wave after wave of opponents. And then after that, once we're kind of happy with how things are going there, we hope to push out that outdoor adventure where you'll once again face sort of a co-op PvE adventure, but there are more questing elements in there, and we're talking about a much more complicated environment with some obstacles in it, etc., etc., that you can make use of and that we can make use of in interesting ways for the creatures that you're fighting. And then finally, the dungeon raid kind of, takes it one step further to some really complex and closed environments, where you're basically taking on a sort of guided raid through the dungeon. Activating machines, waiting for elevators to come down, beating bosses, etc. Kind of, as if WoW had years before its released, the first Ragnaros raid or something like that to its audience, right? So we just want to make sure that all these different aspects of the game experience are already built out to be fun and they're working well, and we've exposed players to them. And indeed, some of these are quite the juicy adventures. They'll start out like, with single levels, if you will, but as we go further, we'll basically release layer after layer of such an adventure. So, for example, for the Ultra Deep, right, when we first bring this out towards our testers, maybe even later the community, right, you'll be able to play maybe only like the level 1 floor, right, of that dungeon, which might be something that is like a 10-15 minute adventure you can go on with your friends. But as we push further down and increase the level of complexity and challenge that you're going to get, eventually you'll be able to play all the way down to the bottom floor and face the final boss, and that alone is like a raid adventure that you could spend quite a few hours going through with your friends. And we're going to pair that, that that whole, like, let's say, scala of PvE experiences, we're going to pair that with our first implementation of gear, items, cosmetics, right? So not only will you be able to have these really great adventures with your friends online in an Ember Sword environment, but you'll also be able to gear up your character, earn some new items, and even get some really kick-ass early adopter cosmetics already to gear up your party and take on these three very different experiences.
Well, dear listener, that was a lot. So, just to sort of reiterate and break these down, because you and I have again off mic discussed this quite a bit. The arena, such as it is going to be a test mostly of our cinematic combat idea, right? The idea that how Ember Sword plays on a micro scale, on a screen space. What the enemies are going to do. And then, just to drive the point home, let's differentiate between the outdoor adventure and the dungeon raid, because ostensibly those two experiences are very similar in some ways. How do they differentiate?
Yeah, I would say the similarity is probably in that both of them have a kind of a adventure nature to them, a kind of a guided, a kind of a quest nature to them. But of course, the outdoor experience being a much more expansive, larger area, and being more, let's say, discovery and more leisurely paced, right? Whereas dungeon raid, that's more like up close, personal, tight, timing based. There's a certain pressure to it, right? You might find yourself trying to escape a floor as a whole slew of robotic creatures have been unleashed, or you might find yourself having to defend a particular asset for a period of time that you have to protect. Let's say this machine that you have to turn on to lower the bridge to the next segment, things like that, right? So there's going to be a real pressure in these dungeon experiences.
It's more intense, owing to its nature, and as a dungeon, duh. So, well, we've covered those, and that's on the near horizon. What's after that? What comes after these experiences?
Yeah, so after that, some of the things we've got coming up that you can kind of see segueing into this very naturally is PvP, right? As you can imagine, us having an arena experience already, PvE is kind of a logical continuation to tackle in there, and it makes for a really clean environment to kind of start trying out our differing PvP mechanics and seeing if that's just as fun as we imagined them. And
well,
then,
yeah,
of
the
course,
blood circle is already there. I mean, might as well use it.
exactly. And then, of course, there is player-owned land, which is going to be a big part of the Ember Sword experience. The fact that you can actually own a chunk of land, and then you yourself, decide what you place down there. And so that's definitely also one of the things we're seeing come in after that, where we'll actually enable some of our early adopters to already own a chunk of land in the game, to kind of set it up and to experience that with their friends. So kind of bringing the social element into the game. But rather than you being stuck with something as simple as a guild hall or apartment, you'll pretty much have your whole own piece of land to use as sort of the center of that universe. Whether that's something that you want to share with everyone in the Ember Sword universe, or whether that's something that you just want for your friends or your guild, or whatever other group of people you want to bring in there.
So on the topic of iterating on a game and, creating something in stages, a while back, you told me a fantastic story about an MMO you worked on called Neocron, where there was this one specific bug that was characteristic to one character archetype, which was incredibly game-breaking, and you caught it just before launch, and it was like a lifesaver that you actually caught it. Can you please go into that? I love that story.
Oh, sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. Actually, the funny thing is, it wasn't even a bug, but it's, I think, a really good example of sort of what happens when you don't get enough testing in, and then, especially with a game as massive as an MMO, there's always going to be some piece of end game content or content that's kind of, off on the edge of the world that people aren't going to explore. And, no matter how good a job you thought you did on your Excel sheet, kind of just, figuring out the initial numbers for all of these items, yeah, it may not quite have turned out the way you imagined. And yeah. This particular story came from Neocron, where we were in like sort of the last stages of testing, and I was involved in the testing for that at the time. And yeah, something just really funny occurred there, in the sense that there was one of the character classes, which was a Psy monk that was kind of like the mage of Neocron, if you will, it being a cyberpunk world. Um, and they basically had their top skills that they could have were Psy and intelligence, and those skills they could max out, and as they got higher in those skills, they would unlock different kind of Psy modules or spells, basically, that you could cast. And like right on the top end of the Psy spell spectrum, there were just a bunch of spells that started giving such little experience that your leveling pace went so low that essentially no one was kind of making it past like level 82-ish out of 100 or something, right? And if you were going to make it past that, it was going to take so long that basically no one would have completed that within that testing cycle, right? So we would have probably released it before these kind of things were these kind of milestones were reached. And that kind of made that immediately a corner of the game that was, of course, rife with content that had never before been touched by players. And so, me seeing kind of that nuke over there, I was like, okay, better do something about that. So I spent a while kind of looking into, hey, how can we, just being a tester at the time, how can I level this character up fast enough? And that was quite a challenge, as all of these spells that you had were just not giving enough XP. But then, like, I kind of tripped onto something, which was a group heal spell that was fairly high level, and it did have a bug. Which is that group heal spell actually healed enemies as well, not just fellow players. And yeah. And so and it was quite a powerful spell. So basically, what I ended up doing is there was this sort of sewer in which there were like 3-star, which was sort of the top tier enemies, giant spider queens that shot sort of these area of effect damage abilities that also damaged other enemies. And so I would literally, I parked myself in between a bunch of these spiders and just constantly cast this group heal. And because it was not just healing me, but all of these sort of boss spiders, that was yielding actually a fair amount of experience. So obviously it was eating up my sort of mana, my Psy, like no tomorrow. So I had to buy actually like a whole lot of boosters and just literally ended up writing a little macro that would just like inject a booster every time, and then cast that spell 3 times and inject another booster, and then I just left the character standing there for a few hours, I think even a whole night, just casting that spell.
A optimum strat.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, exploits for the win. In any case, the morning after I return, and my character, lo and behold, has crossed over level 90 in Psy, and suddenly, these additional spells that previously were completely inaccessible to the population were now within my grasp and usable.
And
so
your grasp
I,
alone, I should mention.
yeah, I was like literally the only Psymonk on the entire beta server at that point that had reached that level. So I went into the shop. I immediately bought all these high level spells, and I just equipped one, and this was interesting. Like there were typical spells that did different kinds of damage there. So you had like energy spells, and you also had spells that did fire damage, ice damage, etc. Right, kind of like a Frost Nova. But you also had a spell called Fire Barrel, and that one I already had. But then up there was a spell called Fire Barrel number 2, right, which was sort of this area of effect, ring of fire that just affected everything in a probably like 15-meter radius or something. So Fire Barrel 1 was fairly decent. It was a good kind of area of effect group combat spell. And so I equipped Fire Barrel number 2. And as I sort of made my way towards the, let's say, the zones where PvP was allowed, in this case it was Pepper Park, for those of you who have ever played Neocron, and there was just a huge battle going on at the entrance of Pepper Park, with one group of players sort of camped out outside of the entrance and the other group kind of trying to bust their way in, probably sort of a 20v20 combat between tanks dishing out really heavy weapon shots, and guys with automatic rifles and stuff like that, and of course also Psymonks running around healing everyone and such. So I figured, well, what better way to test this ability? So I took this Fire Barrel number 2, and I just, knowing that it's an area of effect spell, kind of cast it into the entrance area, which I couldn't really see who was there other than that really heavy artillery fire was coming out from it. And I just saw the fire whoosh kind of out of that area. Then nothing happened for a couple of seconds, and subsequently like 20 people on fire just haphazardly ran out of it and got shot to shreds or died from the fire. And one quick test later, and we had basically realized that the balancing on that spell was off by so much, because the number was sort of interpreted in a more exponential manner rather than a linear one, that essentially it would light people on fire for about 15 to 20 seconds, and that would kill absolutely anything in the game when it came to players. Like literally, there was a like an asbestos armor called, I think, the Inquisitor armor level 4, and if you equipped your entire character like full on with only this level 4 asbestos anti-fire armor, and you had like grabbed an entire stack of medkits and you were spamming the medkits continuously, and I would light you on fire, you would then die within about 10 seconds. There was just no escaping it. In fact, it was so hilarious that the only way for you to survive being lit on fire with Fire Barrel number 2 was a healing spell that was somewhere around level 90 as well. And again, I was the only person in the entire game world that could cast that particular spell. So, on the one hand, we found a really game-breaking issue and managed to squish it before release. And on the other hand, I got to spend a couple of weeks as some kind of malevolent god going around the server, where I could point my finger at anyone to make them burst into flames and die. And for the, let's say, 5 to 10 seconds that they lived through that, I was their only hope of salvation. So yeah, that I think is like a very good cautionary tale of what happens when you have slightly less accessible content and a short test period. You may end up having the sort of killing the whole zone spell left in your arsenal, and yeah, you can imagine what happens when people find out about that one post-release.
And this is why we have an iterative testing process, kids, and this is why Loren is an executive producer and is not testing this at all. We do not want Ember Sword to explode in embers.
Hey you made it to the end. Congratulations! That must mean you like us enough to want more, right? Well, good news!
We're all over the internet. Go to embersword.com and subscribe to our newsletter for a chance to play the game early, as well as the latest interesting tidbits on the game and the team. Join our lovely Discord community over at discord.gg/embersword. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook at PlayEmberSword for regular updates on what we're up to. And remember the basics. Drink water, be kind to each other, and spread the word about Ember Sword.